Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina, the only black Republican in the Senate, is taking the next step toward a bid for president in 2024. He's creating an exploratory committee, making the announcement in a video message today, which he noted is the day marking the beginning of the Civil War at Fort Sumter in South Carolina, his home state.
I will never back down in defense of the conservative values that make America exceptional. And that's why I'm announcing my exploratory committee for president of the United States.
The move signaling his intent to enter that 2024 primary contest. Plus, Scott is in Iowa today. That's a pretty big signal. The first Republican caucus state, of course. Joining me now is NBC Capitol Hill reporter Ali Vitali from Marion, Iowa. Brendan Buck, former communications advisor to Speakers Ryan and Boehner. And Ashley Parker, senior national correspondent for the Washington Post. Welcome all. So, Ali, first to you. Senator Tim Scott is in Iowa. And, of course, another South Carolinian is as well, Nikki Haley. What's he up to today?
Yeah, Andrea, the campaign trail finally getting crowded here in the Hawkeye State. It took, I think, a little bit longer than some of us thought it might for this primary to start heating up. But we are now likely to see another challenger officially be added to the mix. And the only reason that I hedge on that is because Senator Tim Scott today is coming basically as close as you can to launching a presidential bid without actually officially doing it. Today, saying that he'll be launching an exploratory committee and coming here to Iowa first, New Hampshire tomorrow, and then back to his home state of South Carolina on Friday and over the weekend. He'll be doing an event there and then meeting with some donors. And effectively, what the exploratory phase allows him to do is to continue stoking speculation while also starting to build an infrastructure and sort of test the waters with donors and see how this candidacy will be received. And then on the other side of it, you've got former South Carolina governor and UN ambassador Nikki Haley also making her way through the Hawkeye State. It's her third trip here since announcing just about 7 weeks ago. We saw last week that massive fundraising haul from her, $11 million. Today, she's continuing to try to capitalize on that and telling Iowans yesterday, almost as if throwing some shade at someone who we both know loves to throw a rally and then move on to the next place, former President Donald Trump. Haley telling Iowans she's going to be here to shake every hand, not leave any vote for granted, and she's not going to be just one to do a rally and then leave. So that's the way that she's at least referencing Trump without referencing him. But certainly he's looming large over this, even as voters that I talked to, Andrea, say they're open to the possibility of someone else in this field.
So, Brendan, what lane would Tim Scott have in this race? Two South Carolinians. He's popular in the Senate. He was the point person for the senators on trying to negotiate a release on that George Floyd bill, some kind of compromise, which fell apart. But he is a very popular senator.
Absolutely. Look, Ali said that Donald Trump looms large over this race. He certainly does, but also Ron DeSantis does, and I think Tim Scott's folks understand that. There is going to be one person who is the challenger to Donald Trump. And so Tim Scott's challenge is to be that person. I think we have seen that Ron DeSantis may not be as strong as a lot of people expected. And so I think Tim Scott is going to try to be positioning himself as that person who can most effectively take on Donald Trump and do it in a way that presents a real choice, a different type of Republican. And that's clearly what is core to his message. He wants to bring back a level of decency, some semblance of principles and ideas and solutions and policy. And I think there are a lot of people out there in the Republican Party who are desperate for that. Count me among them. The question is, are there a lot of those people? And I think that's what Tim Scott's going to need to figure out, whether that lane is actually big enough to take down a Ron DeSantis so he can be the one to take on Donald Trump.
And former Democratic Representative Donna Edwards joins us as well. Donna, couldn't he also have more strength as a general election candidate than either Ron DeSantis, if he had the nomination, or clearly Donald Trump?
I think potentially. I think the problem that Tim Scott has, as well as other Republicans, is that there still is that very solid Republican base that you can't win a primary without them, but you can't win a general election with them. And so I think that Tim Scott would struggle just as any Republican is going to struggle in a general election if they continue to want to court that base. I mean, he is, a likable senator, but whether he'll be able to take on the likes of Donald Trump and really beat out Ron DeSantis, I think, as Brendan said, in order to do that, remains to be seen. But all of them have to figure out how they're going to deal with a Trump base that remains solidly committed to Donald Trump and whether they'll show up for a general election at all.
And Ashley Parker, of course, the front runner in the race by all polling, no matter what problems legal and otherwise he may have, is Donald Trump. And he spoke with Tucker Carlson at Mar-a-Lago on Fox News last night. And he, again, was very Trumpy in praising the leaders of China, North Korea, and Russia, praising Vladimir Putin, who is a wanted man because of the war crimes charges. Take a listen.
These are top-of-the-line people at the top of their game. President Xi is a brilliant man. How smart is Kim Jong-un? Top of the line. You know, people say, oh, this and that. Really smart. Putin, very smart.
I feel, Ashley, as though I'm back in Helsinki, you know, praising Vladimir Putin. Are we not in a hot war right now in Ukraine? And he's just been charged with war crimes?
I believe he also praised the Saudis and MBS in that interview. But look, Andrea, you know as well as anyone that Donald Trump has long had an obsession with strongman leaders. He thought when he assumed the presidency, he would be a monarch and not a president constrained by democratic norms. In a lot of ways, he's sort of envious of their, dictatorial powers. And so these are not surprising words to hear from someone like former President Trump. But what is interesting is there's a lot of other Republicans in the race who could not say this. You saw briefly Ron DeSantis when he came out not as forcefully in support of Ukraine as a lot of Republican hawks would like. He took a lot of backlash, even though his position was not demonstrably different from that of former President Trump. So it shows again that Trump can say things that would have long been considered apostasy in the Republican Party and get away with it in a way that other Republicans, including 2024 hopefuls, cannot.
So, Brendan, give me your read on the Republican Party and a general election for Donald Trump after praising Kim Jong-un and, President Xi, who's getting bipartisan criticism in Congress, as well as Vladimir Putin, of all people.
Yeah, I mean, Donald Trump has always had the advantage that he can say whatever he wants and will only escalate the rhetoric if you attack him. I think these are outrageous comments. They obviously weaken the moral authority of the United States and the Republican Party. But he's also turned the party into such an isolationist place that if you present Vladimir Putin as an enemy or China as an enemy, that you'll automatically be targeted as wanting to go to war with people and escalate it that way. And so he can always sort of trap you because he doesn't really hold himself to any normal standards. Obviously, this should be an opening for somebody who wants to challenge Donald Trump. The question is whether people are going to start taking swings at him. I mean, every day, seemingly, there's a new opportunity to differentiate yourself with Donald Trump. I would hope that someone like Nikki Haley, I would hope that someone like Mike Pence would see this as an opportunity and put something, a marker out for what we actually stand for as a party and as a country.
Ali Vitali in Iowa, Brendan Buck, Donna Edwards, Ashley Parker. Thanks to all of you.